Let's come to the 10th presentation of 2014. And what we're doing in this particular year of presentations is yet another resonance to a delivery of something that had been worked on for over 40 years. In fact, some almost 42 years by the time work on it was refined enough to consider it done. That work is the Learning Civilization, a 2-year program that is a way of doing a cycle of reconnoitering the best of what we have inherited, and a second year to give it a symmetrical balance, not so much the heritage in its integral cycle and meaning, but to give the differential conscious dimensions that then come out and expand and transform that cycle of nature, the integral cycle of nature, into an ecology of consciousness, of conscious dimensions. It's important to get a sense that composition is the strongest way of seeing. In the daybooks of the great photographer Edward Weston, in the first daybook, he wrote, composition is the strongest way of seeing. And for an art like photography, one has to be ready and primed, because the moment for the shot, for the photograph, is unexpected. One can be in a context, in a situation, but the moment for the great photograph is almost instant, and a great photographer, an artist like Edward Weston or Ansel Adams or Stieglitz, they have a sense of mystical camaraderie with the energy flows and the way in which they begin to get the sense, the pressure, if you will, the buildup that the moment is arriving and one needs to be ready for it, so that you have your technique, your art and your technique, your equipment, and you're checking the light, but you're doing it not just with the equipment, but mostly you're getting into the crusting energy of the way in which that peak will occur, and you're ready to have the photo taken then. For me, the loss of my daughter in 1993 was one of those moments of abject surprise. And in order to commemorate by evaporation of the trough moment, I wanted to make in 1994 a crest moment, like a photographer or like any artist. I wanted to deliver something that would take the trough of her death, which is by a very savage murder, etc., and to give it a crest so that there would be a balance, and the balance of troughs and crests of energy, because energy is primordial in the universe. Before there is space, there is time, and time spontaneously emerges out of the zero field of nature. And As soon as time occurs as the first dimension, it instantly blossoms space, the other three dimensions. So one needs to revise space-time to be able to be uttered time-space. That's really the accurateness. But it takes a conscious dimensioning to be able to recognize this. To all cognition, it's space-time at its best, like in Einstein. But time-space is the full conscious dimensioning of it. So to commemorate the 1-year trough in 1994 was a crust, and I presented 4 presentations together as a set and chose a place that old friends had run for decades at that time, the very famous Bodhi Tree bookstore here in Los Angeles. The owner-founders, Stan Madsen and Phil Thompson, very good friends. And so that series, the harmonic of the 4 together, was called Our New Aeon. And in 2001, to commemorate the 8th year of that, we published a volume, Our New Aeon. And some 10 years later, in 2011, we decided to expand that and republish it. And so in 2012, Our New Aeon was released in this form, and later in 2014 will be made available as one of about 30 books of mine. It should be out in the next year or two. And I wanted to give just a flavor for a moment. This is from the first pair of presentations was on Hermetic America and stellar civilization. The second pair was on shared presence and Jesus in Alexandria. So those pair of pairs make together not just 4, but 2 squared. 2 to the square, and in space, in celestial mechanics, the squares are related to the cubes of time. So the squares of space and the cubes of time are a way in which one comes to understand the integral, exacting thusness of the universe and all aspects of it, which can also be matured in a beautiful, real way if one is able to rescue from the troughs and to celebrate at the crests. In between those is the invisible horizon of the primordiality out of which time occurs, emerges as the first dimension of the universe, and that continuity, that continuum, is the zero field of nature, which then allows for the timeline, which in its origin has a 0 dimension, and when it flows, when it occurs, it flows as a continuum, which is a 1. The first dimension is oneness, which gives the flavor of the integral to the entire cycle of nature. This is from Stellar Civilization, just a couple of sentences. This was added to the 1994 presentation, which will be given a chance to have its original transcript and also recording. And this was the 2011 refinement of that after now some 17 years and published 18 years later. The language I'm going to use belongs in the year 2011. It belongs at a time when this kind of speaking, the kind of envisioning will be necessary and needed, like air and food. There are times when human beings need vision. It is a little early, and that day has not yet dawned. And for many of us, we're content to continue to snooze in the dark hours, thinking it is still regular night. Indeed, everything has changed. One of the qualities that the new aeon has is a shared quality. For the last 2,000 years, the archetype of the deep self has been the person. The person is a kind of odd protean way. I've called it the mysterious person archetype. The traditional pattern is that the person, the inner, quote, inner person, as the integrative focus, or that on a deeper, more mystic level, that the integration of all meaning into our deep self comes to some vanishing point of mystery and resurges back out, unbidden, unqualified, as a differential process of life-giving vision. It is a deep visionary quality that now is emerging with such diverse rapidity that it has almost become a blizzard of insight for those who are able to course in the field of vision. The field of nature, being a zero field, does not give any trace whatsoever, except that it is fertile because the energy of the universe emerges as time, which eventually will be the first dimension. The first dimension, not just of 4, but the first dimension of 11 dimensions. And as we will see again and again and again in the 2014 Parayana, that the 11th dimension is the fertility of the 0 dimension. That the 0 dimension becomes fertile in an ordinal way, extraordinary ordinal way, because the 1 and the 0 pair together to make a 10, so that the 11 is the first time that one has the tuning fork of the two ones, meaning that it can be seen not only as a two ones, it can be seen as two ones tuned together as an 11. It can be seen as beginning again the counting from 1, 2, 3 on, 11, 12, 13 on, and that one has then in 10 a perfect 10, as the saying goes. It is the 1 and the 0 where the oneness is completely in equanimity with the 0. And so a 10, like today is the 10th presentation in 2014 of the Parayana. That 10 means that there are 10 dimensions in a conscious cosmos that finally yield their best perfume, as it were. Not just the blossom and the fruit, but the fragrance, the perfume. In the Mahayana, in the High Dharma, it was always originally talked about as the perfuming. One becomes sensitive, not to a sweet smell, but of the fragrance of the real, which is deeper than the true. The true is deep enough, is a Dharma, but the real is high Dharma. And that perfuming, that flavor, as you wish, is a delicacy that only occurs when the 10 dimensions come together in a synergy where the 4 dimensions, like the 4 fingers, are joined by a 5th dimension, the thumb, of vision. That vision as the first conscious dimension, the field of consciousness which is infinite. So that an infinite field gives us the grasp of the 4-dimensional universe, and one now has the beginnings, not just of a universe, but of a new universe, because vision is able to begin a whole resonant wave sequencing, cycling, ecology of transformation. The interesting thing is that preparing just yesterday, beginning to prepare for this presentation on the Daily Galaxy on the web, there was a beautiful presentation of great discoveries in science and space, and it was all about the Kepler mission, the Kepler satellite, being able to enlarge our view of the universe, because Kepler has the ability to do a special kind of photography. The photography is a very strong way of seeing, a la Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, Stieglitz, and so forth. 5 years ago today, on March 6, 2009, NASA's Space Telescope rocketed into the night skies to find planets around other stars with a field of view 1/400th the size of the Milky Way, in search of potentially habitable worlds. And in the meantime, the Kepler telescope, by being able to take, it says 1/400th of the Milky Way, which stretches farther than the night sky at any one place, is a tremendous field to be able to look initially at not just thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions of stars. To be able to commence seeing not only the stars in a composition, but to astrophysically be able to index the slightest movement in the spectroscopy of the star's light, that each minute, minuscule thing that happens in a star's field will be affected in its light, and the movement of planets around a star will show up in the star's light. One of the earliest little books, when astronomy was beginning to emerge as astrophysics, was called Starlight published, I brought several times a copy of it, in the First World War era, Harlow Shapley, who later on became one of the most famous astronomers in the world, in the United States, particularly a very good friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, etc., and whose daughter, Mildred Shapley, born in 1914, 100 years ago, became, after she married a man named Matthews, Mildred Shapley Matthews. She was one of the great editors of many of the huge volumes published by the University of Arizona Press in Tucson. She was the composing editor, the one who was able to see how all of this research on the various aspects of our astronomy, especially on our planets in this star system, because our sun is not just a sun, it is a part of a star system of planets, of moons, of comets, etc., etc., etc. I will bring a couple of the almost 1,000-page volumes. She did maybe a dozen of them during her lifetime, and was a direct inheritor from her father of being able to carry this on. In many ways, the Kepler instrument was named for someone who was very much like a Mildred Shapley Matthews, in that he inherited the genius capacities of initial observation from someone that he was very close to. And Kepler, Johannes Kepler, he lived from 1571 to 1630. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. He was one of the great mathematicians of all time. He was one of the greatest scientists of all time, and usually is put into a triad, a triangle, at which modern astronomy begins to understand that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth, in fact, is not the center of very much except its own planetary qualities. He went to work for a rough and tumble genius named Tycho Brahe, Danish. And Brahe was a carouser, among other things, and lost his nose to a knife in a bar fight and had to have a silver nose. But he was a genius, and so the king of Denmark gave him his own private island on which to set up an astronomical utopian observatory. It was called Uraniborg, for the beautiful quality that there is, in fact, a Urania to the mystery. And eventually, when a new planet was discovered beyond Saturn, it was called Uranus. But in Uraniborg, this was before telescopes could be refined as by Galileo. And Galileo was a follower of Copernicus, who said the sun is the center of the star system and the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around, which is quite astounding because in Copernicus' time, almost more than 500 years ago, today a poll was taken just a couple of weeks ago. 60% of the American public think that the sun goes around the Earth. Think about it. 60% do not even know enough to know that the Earth goes around the sun. They have no way whatsoever of understanding the layers and layers and layers of manipulation, obfuscation, but mainly ignorance that keep them bound like mummies, alive under all the bandaging, buried away in monolithic places that are pyramids of not eternity, but where the dead repose in tombs. And so the entombed mummies of population need to be reawakened into qualities which the Learning Civilization program, the 2006-07 was the 12th of the sets of offering of the 2-year program, whose basis went back decades before that, all the way into San Francisco in the mid-1960s. For Kepler, who joins Copernicus and Galileo as the third, as the triangle, the way in which the firm quality of a new astronomy was laid was because he took the observations of Tycho Brahe. Tycho used to lay in this large apparatus and observe the motions of the planets, of the moving stars, of the sun, of the moon, of Mercury, of Venus, of Mars, of Jupiter, of Saturn, and keep meticulous records, understanding that the slightest movement, when taken, not just as a gestalt, but as a movable feast of scalars, that someone would be able to put all of this together, not just in an integral, but in a differential, mathematique, in order to understand what does all this mean then. And it was Kepler who took all of the meticulous observations of Brahe, of Tycho, one of the biggest craters on the moon, because is named Tycho for Tycho Brahe. Kepler is a smaller yet very large crater up in the Ocean of Storms. Kepler was able to understand that the planets do not have circular orbits. The math showed that their orbits are elliptical. And because they're elliptical, it means that in order for them to keep a realistic course of orbital, the orbital dynamics must fit elliptical combinations, that all the planets in all of their ellipses must make a composition of our star system. And he was gifted in 1604, about the same time that Shakespeare was writing and producing plays like Hamlet and Macbeth. Kepler came out with a book that stands alongside of Hamlet. In fact, all the plays of Shakespeare put together. It was called The New Astronomy. And the new astronomy was that apex, was that crest of the energy of the conscious dimension, that now the trough of ignorance is balanced in such a way that the flow of the zero field of nature is encouraging the fertility of the zero field to accept the infinite field of vision, mating together in a marriage that allows then for that five-dimensional, that fifth magical dimension of consciousness to come into play and transform the integral cycle into a differential ecology. Because out of that, those who can witness and participate. Witness that vision. Then participate and become the persons capable of a creative imagining. And that creative imagining with a denominator of remembering are able then to put that numerator of creative imagining into play to make a new art. And so the art and the vision together made it possible for the witnessing and the participating to not only have the ratioing of the creative imagining over the remembering, but for its symmetrical complement of having remembering as the numerator and creative imagining as the denominator, and that is history. History is not the record of the past. That is a fictive, diseased mentality. The arts are the way in which there is an island of creative, like an archipelago of creative achievement going on in between the infinite seas of vision and the tremendous kaleidoscopic deltas of history. And out of those kaleidoscopic deltas of history will come science. So that as vision and history are a differential conscious pairing symmetry, the arts and the sciences are differential and kaleidoscopic qualities of reality coming into play. In a beautiful study of Kepler and the new astronomy, a very famous writer on Kepler prefaces his chapter 6, where he's going to be writing about Kepler's famous dream. He gives the quotation in translation by Kepler, written in 1628, November 6th. When the storm is raging and the shipwreck of state is threatening, there is nothing nobler for us to do than to let down our anchor of peaceful studies into the depths of eternity. That 11th dimension of fertility that Mother Nature has from our witnessing, our participation, our researching so that the aesthetic and the analytic shake hands, so that the differential and the kaleidoscopic clap hands. Then one has a 10th dimension of hyperspace, which is where all star system civilizations have their concourse. Looking for radio signals is like thinking that the wind blowing leaves into a sandbox will tell you anything about the forest. Let's have a break. Let's come back to Kepler for a moment. Not only Kepler in terms of the new astronomy some 410 years ago, putting science on the level of art, Kepler and Shakespeare. One of the great operas of our time is Kepler by Philip Glass. And Glass is one of the most famous of all of the composers of the 20th century. Philip Glass is in his late 70s, born in Baltimore. Studied the composition at the best places, the University of Chicago, Juilliard School of Music, and then with Nadia Bollinger in Paris, and then all of his musical compositional savvy underwent a transformative vision. He studied with Ravi Shankar and his tabla player, Ala Takla. It showed him something about the sophistication of Indian music, especially the raga, and its sensitivities to minuscule variations within what initially sounds like repetition. But the nuances, when one becomes used to it, are almost like a Feldenkrais method of application of rhythmic variation that rejuvenates. In the raga musicality, there are 22 keys, but hardly anyone ever uses the full 11 that would be hearable even in minuscule, attentive exactness, because most of those dimensions come before sound registers in emergence. The Sanskrit term for that field, a zero field before sound occurs, because sound cannot occur until there's space, and space cannot occur until there's time, and time before it emerges. There is a fertile silence that allows for all of it to come together. The Sanskrit word for that is sphota, S-P-H-O-T-A. And we talked about some presentations ago, there was a Sphota temple built in northwest India in very ancient times. It's today a part of what is called Pakistan, which is a Johnny-come-lately to anything. That was a part of India 5,000, 7,000 years ago. The Sphota temple was situated where there is an alluvial plain that comes out from the Khyber Pass. The Khyber Pass, which goes to Afghanistan, and that narrow pass, when it comes out from Afghanistan, comes out to another kind of alluvial sound opening, and it's in that field that Kabul, ancient Kabul, was formed. And in the Kabul of 4,000 years ago, that was then a complement to the Sphota temple that was there about 3,500 years ago, mediated by the Khyber Pass, where the echo of a sound begins to have a kind of a cacophony that one can hear as a distant clattering murmur. In that Kabul of 4,000 years ago lived Zarathustra, who was from Central Asia, from the area around Samarkand, but in his travels, his name in Avesta, which is the language of those ancient days, his name was not Zarathustra, but Zarathustra. Zarat means the best, really good at, and Ustra were the camels. So that Zarathustra's family were associated with caravans, the long caravan routes that went from Samarkand all the way thousands of miles into the Gobi Desert and to China. They're the ones whose caravans brought all kinds of fruits, like the peach, and flowers, like the rose, and everything into China, and also brought the horses and the chariots, which they were the first people in the world to make. And so they not only had that northern road that became the Silk Road, but they had a southern road going around the bottom of the Taklamakan Gobi Desert, and I have named that the Jade Road, because on the way there, ancient Khotan was where two streams came down out of the Kunlun Mountains, the Dragon Mountains, and in those two streams were found the white jade and what is called the black jade, the dark spinach green jade. And so the introduction of chariots and jade and flowers and fruit came into China just at the time when the kingship was getting a little stale, and the first dynasty was made in China about the time that Zarathustra had moved, because he had married the king of Kabul's daughter, and he wrote his Gathas there. And as Zarathustra's Gathas are the first time that a written language, poetic, was able to be not just read but sung. That's why they're called Gathas, because one sang them, one intoned them, is a pedestrian way to say it. They were sung. They were sung because it's the first compositional quality, and he learned that because that whole region was under the influence of a great caravan empire that was to the south of the mountain ranges that Central Asia into Gobi, China, were complemented by a route that went from Cyprus to the Indus River civilizations that was under Sargon of Akkad. And Sargon of Akkad not only had the world's great empire of commercial trade and travel, but his daughter Enheduanna is the first person to ever compose a harmonic set of hymns. She composed 42 of them, because in ancient Sumer, the Sumerians had set up various cities, and there were 42 different temple god hierarchies, and she harmonized all 42 in a set called the Temple Hymns. And when they were intoned, they had to be intoned in a very creative language. And so the Akkadian language, to get its intonation to sing the hymns, she took the myths of Inanna and made an epic out of the Inanna myths into this way in which the intoning of her ancient Akkadian language was the basis of the kind of music that one could hear if one could translate the Avestan of Zarathustra into English, which I have done. One could hear in between the words the flow, refreshing, that the silence is a part of the singing. It is the timing of the singing that gives the inflection, not in tones that can be heard, but anyone who is able to hear ragas with spiritual dimensions of consciousness, hears the breath of the eternal. That's the phrase that when Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda here in Los Angeles at the Vedanta Temple translated the Upanishads, they call it the collection, not the Upanishads, but the breath of the eternal. Because it's in the chanting of the Upanishads also that one is able to hear not just the sounds, but to kinesthetically, intuitively feel the dynamic of the soundless silence of the eternal. And that is where the art of language achieves its greatest. When Homer was doing his epics, the Iliad for men and their wrath into war, and then the Odyssey, women and their patience into love. And when he finished that pair of epics, he wrote his Homeric hymns. Hymn to Apollo, hymn to Hermes, and so on. And so it is the epics of Homer that get tuned to the Homeric hymns, where one learns the diction of Greek when it had 1,000 years of forerunners from about 2000 BC to Homer at about 1000 BC, where the beginnings of a classical Greek that would forever be recognized as classical Greek that came with Homer, who was a contemporary of King David, who did the classical Hebrew in his psalms, which are meant to be sung. It's called Samadhi. And if you cannot sing in Hebrew, if you cannot chant in Greek, if you cannot speak Zarathustra in his speaking, if you cannot hear ragas in India, then it's difficult to understand that someone like Philip Glass, who's now in his late 70s, his first compositional success didn't come until 1975. He was born in 1937, and it was an opera called Einstein on the Beach. And with Einstein on the Beach, everyone was able to hear at last, this is an operatic raga about science in the apex of the 20th century lunge to try and find a way to, quote, humanize science. And what better storytelling protagonist to be sung than Albert Einstein under Philip Glass, who had learned so much about India that he did an opera called Satyagraha. Sat in Sanskrit is truth. It is cognate. Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, and the European languages have still the word sit. When one sits at the feet and has heard and learns this way, the sat is the sitting and the graha is the grasping, not the grasping to get, but the grasping of the fifth dimensional thumb of visionary consciousness that brings the integral of space-time into the delicate, manipulable qualities of the filigree necessary for art. He learned from Ravi Shankar, who taught him about Gandhi and about Gandhi's Satyagraha, that you don't have to use weapons. You do not use force. You bring into play the silence that is further dimensions that are rooted in, anchored in eternity. And so what occurs is the dissolve of the falsity and the evaporation of the misleading, the deceptive. And one then begins to have something where you could do an opera like Philip Glass did about the Dalai Lama, Kundran. Or he could do an opera like La Belle et la Bête, The Beauty and the Beast, especially Jean Cocteau's version of it. He's done symphonies, Symphony Number 3. He's done violin concertos. He's done things like Kakwayatsi, original motion picture soundtrack. And so it is this quality that the 21st century is gifted to have. It is a way in which the Hopi word, Kwanakatsi, or the Sanskrit word svota, or the Avestan word gasas, which then, when it is given its translation into an Indian language that was just beginning, Sanskrit, gasa in Sanskrit became pronounced a little bit different, became Gita. And so one has the Avestan mantra becomes mantra. And so Zarathustra's Avestan informed the way in which there was about 1500 BC a development of Sanskrit in India. And at the same time, there was a movement that also went into Egypt on the other side of the resonances. And about 1500 BC, you had someone in Egypt, the first Egyptian pharaoh who was a woman, Hatshepsut. And she was tuned to the 1500 BC beginning Sanskrit with the Rig Veda, which commemorated that. And so Egypt and India, about 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago, had a meeting of the spirits, and the in-between fulcrum was Ethiopia, the ancient land of Sheba, which is why the Ethiopians are India, Egyptian, African men and women to this day. One has to be able to understand history, art, and vision, as well as the cycle of integral, in order to have all of the dimensions that come together as a grand complementarity that then generates that third kind of space, the hyperspace, where a conscious cosmos is fertile enough to reach all the way around and begin anew at any instant that the fertility emerges or absorbs. And so all the particality of a quantum subatomic world comes in and out as freely as breathing of a phenomenality of absorption, of emission, of absorption. And it is this dance of energy that is real. There is no way that there is any positing of something false once that is released into the dimensions of consciousness. Another great musical composer genius is Vangelis of the 20th century. And his great, one of his great soundtracks was for Blade Runner, as well as Chariots of Fire and so forth. His Methodia was the way of doing a kind of an operatic outdoor event on an Athens night about the missions to Mars, about the way in which the mythology of Mars was being transformed, not reduced to the technology of machines, but of being expanded consciously so that the myth became a methodia. It became a music composition. It was huge, long, complicated, loved, and presented underneath the Acropolis ruins in late 20th century Athens, and then heard round the world. The same for a third example of 20th century kaleidoscopic and differential consciousness, Alan Hovanus, who passed away at age 91. His compositions, many of them interstellar, Star Dawn, Celestial Fantasies, Celestial Gate, Visionary Landscapes, Visions, all of this from an Armenian who married a Scottish woman in Boston and whose son, Alan Hovanus, became one of the first of the stellar civilization composers before Vangelis, before Philip Glass, who in his composing vision, while he was held in high regard by various musical groups and composers in schooling, underwent a visionary change in the Second World War in the 1940s, and all but a handful of his music he burned. He said, I had not understood music. Now I'm going to write to begin to approach. And after that, he managed to become the Mozart of the 20th century. He had over 400 compositions, among them 67 symphonies, and yet to be found, yet to be discovered, though one can go a long time. Another Vision CD that came out, Hildegard of Bengan, she had to wait 900 years. 900 years before her music could be heard, before her art could be seen, before her prismatic person could be appreciated. Why? Because something happened vis-a-vis Hildegard of Bengan when she lived in the 1100s, in the 12th century, that sealed off her work so that it was not heard, it was not seen, it was not understood. She was invisible. She was non-existent because her correspondent, her number one correspondent was Bernard of Clairvaux, the founder of the Carthusian order. Lots of correspondence, almost none of it survived. Many compositions. There was a whole packet of CDs made to celebrate the 900th birthday of her in 1979. Her music was not heard, her art was not seen, her person was not recognized, because Bernard was an agent of the ruling established order under the Pope, under ritual Orthodox Roman Christian Empire holding. And Bernard of Clairvaux was an arch rival of Peter Abelard, and sought to muffle also Abelard's wife and dear love, Heloise, so that their whole appreciation would have been lost, except for the fact that Abelard was a Odyssean-type figure who survived Heloise's angry uncle that Abelard was going to need to marry because he was going to have a child with his niece Heloise. The child, a boy, was born named Astrolabe, and Astrolabe is the instrument by which one does celestial reckoning. One of the great scenes in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is the use of the astrolabe to be able to understand where we are in the universe. Is not just looking astrologically at ideology of stars, but being able to observe and do the computational kind of observing that one can navigate by. And with the astrolabe, one of the first of the instruments, predating the telescope, one learned to do an expansion of trigonometry into celestial mechanics. That's how it began. It is an interesting thing that in the 21st century, one can hardly find anyone, anywhere, who understands these things. And yet, from time to time, era to era, they are rediscovered and brought into play in France, because Heloise and Abelard were in northern France, around Paris. He, after the castration, in a couple of years, was able to bring himself back into play, and he developed a school, not just a monastery, but a school. It couldn't be a monastery because eventually it became a convent. His school became a convent, and it was called the Paraclete, from St. John's Gospel. Jesus said, I must go so that I can send you the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, who will teach you all things always. This school became so popular that even though he had been condemned at a council engineered by Bernard of Clairvaux, as soon as the Paraclete began to have many buildings, finally had about a dozen buildings, and Abelard again was like the lion of philosophy of the 1100s, of the 12th century. He was the star, male intellect of the 12th century Renaissance. Bernard of Clairvaux engineered a second condemnation hearing to silence Abelard completely, that he couldn't keep him muffled like he had muffled with a kind of a sly way Hildegard of Bengan's art and music and so forth, and had made it seem that somehow Abelard was a knave, and Heloise thus a waif who had been taken advantage of, and all of this was just foolish, and that he was really the important one, and the Pope was really the deciding one. And it's interesting because Abelard's ethical writings has received in the last decade a new edition of translation. Ethics, the dialogue between a philosopher, a Jew, and a Christian. And the great study of Abelard's ethics is published years ago by Oxford University Press. And it's interesting because the origin of Abelard's ethics is that Plutarch's great series of essays in antiquity in the 1st century AD into the beginnings of the 2nd. He was born in 45 AD and died in 120 AD. And in between then, to augment his great new epic form, which was the parallel lives, he tuned people's hearing, their seeing, their reading, and their reading it aloud, and their thinking expansion. He called all of these together, that set, he called it the Ethica. The Ethica. Because the way in which an integral comes into its symbolic way of application in the world, of what you do in harmonic, not just with ideology, but with the ideas being the play of that eternity where the forms come spontaneously into time, into energy that then makes the blossoming of space and the flowering of the way in which phenomenality can occur and stay and be stable. And that blossoming, that fruit, makes the perfume. Plutarch's great, beautiful epic was the Parallel Lives. That a life of a prismatic person is so complex, the only background against which that can be seen is another person. So that when you pair persons, when you tune the pair of persons, you're able to understand both vis-a-vis each other simultaneously. So Plutarch took a famous Greek, and a famous Roman, and paired them, tuned them, so that the parallel lives of Plutarch, he did about 50 lives. There are actually 46 made into pairs, and there are 4 that are singular, but most of it is parallel. For instance, the pairing of Alexander the Great was Julius Caesar. So that the parallel lives of Plutarch was, for me, almost 44 years ago, one of the ways in which I began the program that became the Learning Civilization in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I needed something to go with a course on symbols and a course on world mythology, because I could see, I could vision, I knew by then. I'd written Sequoia Matrix Sutra in 1960, 10 years before. I knew how to see, how to hear. I knew how to free thought. And I saw that symbols and myth pair. I needed a second pairing, and the parallel lives was the resolving third as a new pair. And all of this came to be what we are talking about now, and more next week.